Dick and Miriam Whitmer were personal friends of ours, so I bought all my cars. And it was well worth driving up over Peters Mountain because they gave me I had about 30 cars over the years because I drove about 50,000 miles a year to speaking engagements up and down the East Coast. And Dick always gave me a good deal. So I found your shop up there one day. I think you were just a teenager at the time, but in any event, we do go back quite a way. Well, I'm glad to be here with all of you. I think most speakers begin by saying that, and very few of them mean it, but I do, because first of all, this was only a 10-minute drive for me to get to this meeting. And secondly, I've never spoken to a group of people who were involved in auctions in any way. I've attended lots of them, but this will be a first for me. I never forget one auction, however, that my wife and I attended. Oh, by the way, when we retired, my wife is a registered nurse, and she worked at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York. She was in charge of the male surgical ward there. And I was interning at Bellevue Hospital there, with the psychiatric branch of Bellevue. And through the years, we attended auctions just for fun. But after retirement, both my wife and I retired, we decided to sell antique clocks because my father-in-law was an antique clock dealer down in York in his retirement years. So he had about 25 or 30 clocks left, and we didn't want to put them up for auction because you always lose your shirt that way. But, oh, excuse me, but we decided we'd keep them. And then we decided, let's sell them. And somebody said to me, now I'm 89 years old, by the way. I'm so old that this was before there was a thing called the internet. There was nothing like a computer. And in those days, if you wanted to sell antiques, generally you had to sell them at auction or in a shop. And we decided, we were ready for retirement at that point, that we would, it was just when the internet was coming along, somebody introduced me to a thing called a website. I thought it was a spider, or what is a website? And anyway, to make a long story short, they put one together for us, and immediately our business expanded all over the world. We sold 3,000 antique clocks through the years, importing and exporting and just having a good time. Some of them there, David, at the farm show. Now, I didn't mean to talk about this, but don't worry, because David's going to tell me when it's time to quit. At the one show, we had a tall clock, a grandfather clock for sale. And a guy came through and looked at it. He said, I'll take it. Now, nobody ever started that way, They say, what do you take for this? He said, I'll take it. Oh, I said, that's wonderful. And he said, I'm buying it for the mayor of Harrisburg. I said, you are? It was a clock that had historic significance for the city. And he said, yes. And so at any rate, he said, take down my name and address. I'm representing the mayor. And he said, we'll come in and take this at the end of the show, and we'll send you a check. I said, he said, you don't have to worry. He said, the money's coming from the Harrisburg Fund, F-U-N-D. I said, what in the world is that? He said, you shouldn't know. Anyway, to make a long story short, that was the only thing I ever sold except to Sandy Cordier. By the way, Cordier is best, right? Not Cordier. You get both. I like Cordier. It's a little more class. But at any rate, that's right. That was the only thing we ever sold so quickly, except when Sandy Cordier was sitting on our front porch filling out the paperwork. She was selling our house in Camp Hill, and there was a guy that evidently worked for her, was putting a sign down in the front yard that said for sale. one of our neighbors was walking down the street. He said, "I'll take it." And, well, of course, Sandy and I were both shocked. And I said to her, quick, "Raise the price." But he said, "My sister lives up at State College, and she wants to move down here to be closer to the family." He was just 2 doors away. Anyway, I didn't mean to tell that story, but that's why we were in the antique clock business, to keep occupied after I stopped being a psychotherapist and my wife stopped being well, she didn't. She worked most of the time. In any event, what I'd like to talk about today is something that I've talked about to every kind of group imaginable, because it has to do with maturity. Not age, not how old you are, although that word does fit age, but rather psychological or personal, personality, everything about you and your life and your maturity, because no one will ever really have an enjoyable life or a successful life or a productive life. You can add any adjective you want there, unless they're mature. And all of us mature to a certain extent, but some people need a little goad, and that's what I've done for the last 30 or 40 years, traveling around giving a message on the marks of maturity. So that's what I'm going to do today. Now, I have I've numbered these points, and it goes on and on. We could be here all afternoon, but we will not. I'll finish when David will take the place. You'll be the surrogate for Sue, for my wife. When I spoke at meetings, I've spoken at the White House and at the CIA and all over everywhere, West Point. My wife always came with me because she'd sit in the back and she'd go like this. That meant it's over, finish and go home. Or if I got dogmatic, she'd make a fist, and that meant lighten it up. Don't be so dogmatic. Or if I got hung up on a point, she'd go like this. What is that thing? She'd go like this. Well, we used to use a megaphone. See, I'm 89 years old. In any event, we went down to York one time, David, and it was back in the old days when almost all auctions were conducted on site. And we were in the big hall down in the York Fairgrounds. Well, there must have been 200 people sitting in there. And I don't know what they were selling. It was a general line of things, and there were some clocks. Anyway, we were late getting there. And when we got in there, only seats left were in the very back of the room, but that was okay. So we went back and found 2 seats and sat down, and the auction continued. And the fella, or my wife rather, poked me a little bit, and I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "I need to go to the restroom." I said, "Oh, all right." But she said, "I don't know where it is." And I asked the guy next to me, I said, "Where's the restroom?" "Oh," he says, "way down the other end of the hall, next to where the auctioneer is. It's down." He said, "See that door?" I said, "Yes." So I told her. She said, "I'll be back." So she left. Well, time went by, and she didn't come back. And I said to the guy next to me, "I wonder what happened to my wife." And he said, "I don't know," but he said, "I think that may be your wife way down there by the restroom door." I said, "Was she locked out?" And he said, "No, she can't remember where we're seated. She's looking around." And I said, "Oh," and I waved like this. The guy next to me said, "I think you just bought a diamond brooch." And I said, "Oh, Lord, please let someone else bid." Fortunately, somebody else did. But anyway, I learned then when you go to an auction, you don't blink an eye, you don't nod your head, you don't look to the right or the left, you don't raise your hand. If something itches, you don't scratch it. You just sit there for fear you will buy diamond brooches. Anyhow, that's my auctions. I only tell this story when I'm speaking to people who are due with auctions. Anyway, let's begin. You say, "Oh, good grief, didn't he start yet?" Well, that's all right. I'm going to number these points because these all apply to you and to me. Number 1, a person who is mature has to be realistic. Now, that's pretty obvious. And you may say, "Well, realistic about what?" Well, many things. The way you look, your appearance, your education, whatever. I remember going up to Whitmer's many times when I needed to have my cars inspected or worked on. They had one mechanic up there who was really good. I mean, that guy could fix anything. So I drove the whole way up Peters Mountain to get my cars repaired. And I was standing there one day. Now, this is illustrating realism, being realistic about your education. Because as I was standing there, I always supervise when anyone comes into our home or does any work for me. I supervise what they do. I don't know what they're doing, but I watch anyway. And the guy working on my car was named Harold. I knew him for a while. I knew he was good. And he was on one of those little sleds that you lay down on with wheels, and he was under the car. And there were nails and nuts and bolts and wires. He had removed all kinds of stuff. And he slid out. I said, "Hey, Harold." He said, "Oh, hi." I said, "Are you ever going to get that all put back together again?" "Oh, yeah." He said, "Sure, no problem." And he slid back under the car. Well, after a while, he came out again, and I said, "Harold." He said, "What's that?" I said, "You are really talented and skilled. You must have a very high IQ." Now, Harold did what nobody should do. He denied it. "Oh, no." He said, "Not me." He said, "I never even graduated from high school." But he said, "I am kind of handy." And I said, "Oh, Harold," I said, "you are better than almost any man I've ever met or any woman I've ever met in working." Nobody could put this car back together. But Harold, you see, was not mature when it came to accepting a realistic appraisal of his ability. He was thinking, "I'm just a mechanic." I said, "Just a mechanic?" I said, "Half the people in the world couldn't do this." Anyway, he slid back under the car and to get rid of me, I guess. And I thought to myself, well, Harold is not realistic about his education. Now, it may have to do with your appearance, the way you look. I know a lady. Now, by the way, men and women are equally deficient in many ways. I'm not being a chauvinist here, although I grew up in the days when I would have been. But anyway, I know a lady who uses too much makeup. She's not realistic about the way she looks. She must put about a half pound of dime store topsoil, they call it, on her face, all over her face. And she paints eyebrows. Now, it's all right to paint your eyebrows, but she paints them about 4 inches thick. A big black line across this way, and then one that goes up to a point over here. She looks scary when you first meet her. Then also, she paints a lot of clown lips, I call them. Bright red lips, twice the size of her real mouth. Oh, she's a sight for sore eyes. Now, on the other hand, I can tell under all of that topsoil that she's a rather attractive-looking lady. She's a senior citizen, but she's pretty. She would be pretty if you could just wash all of that off. But she's not realistic, you see, about when she looks at herself in the mirror. She thinks, I need to do something more to improve my looks. So she's not being realistic about the way she looks. So Harold, with education, with this lady, with her appearance, and by the way, most of us do a little bit of hyping about ourselves, sort of patting ourselves on the back. But we don't need to do that. I do it when I send out a resume like to David here. Say, well, I spoke at West Point to the faculty and at the White House. It doesn't matter, because old Bob Jones had a saying that I like, and that is, the average man is average. And that's right, the average woman is average. And because of that, you see, well, I'm going to write a book. Oh, I already have one that was published and sold for a couple of years, but I'm going to write another one. I have the title already. That's all I've gotten to is the title. But it's the title of the book that I'm writing is It's Okay to be Average, because almost everyone else is. And so it's okay for you to be average. You don't need to go around, none of us, pumping up our background. I do it on my resume because they want to justify having me as a speaker. But I spoke at a meeting one time, and a lady came up, and she was a sharpshooter. We who do speaking know who sharpshooters are. They probably do it at auctions, too, with the auctioneer. But she came up, and I knew that she was loaded for bear. And she said to me, may I ask you a question? This is an older lady. I said, yes. Oh, she had furs and fancy clothing. She said, why should I believe anything that you said today? Now, being a psychologist, we get several $100s an hour for nodding our head. I mean, you come in, you spend an hour there, and we repeat back to you what you said, and then we collect $100. Well, these days, $200-300. Anyway, she said, why should I believe anything that you just said today? And I said, well, why do you think that you should believe what I said? She said, I don't know. She said, are you famous? I said, have you ever heard of me? She said, no, not until this meeting. I said, well, then I guess I'm not famous. And she said, well, why should I have listened to you going through? Well, I could see what she was trying to. You see, when we don't feel very good about ourselves, when some people have a very, very limited image of themselves, then what they need to do, and often do, is to pare you down to the same size so that they feel comfortable. So I knew she was working on that, had her paring knife out. And I said, okay. I said, let me tell you this. I'm not famous. I said, you've never heard of me. And I said, they're not paying me all that much for coming here. And I said, what I told you, I think would bear listening to, but I am really not well known. And she said, I thought so. And I said, because if I was, I wouldn't have to be here speaking to the likes of you. And then she laughed. She said, oh, touche. She said, that's right. I guess I'm not famous either. I said, that's right. So from one unfamous person to another, you can believe what I said. All right. So that was number one. Have to think realistically. You say, good grief, did you only do 1 point? Yeah, well, look, I've got 18 of them, and I'm not going to do more than 2 or 3, so be of good cheer. All right. Number one, have to think realistically about your education, your status in life, what you've accomplished, what your marriage, if you're married, or your children. Be realistic about it and say the average person is average. And that's good. In my book title, It's Okay to Be Average. When I finish writing it, I wish you'd all buy one. All right, number two. Oh, yes, this is good. A person who's mature is able to handle disappointments and frustration without getting upset and striking out at people. Now, this is my weakness. If Sue was here, she'd be nodding her head. That's him, all right. Because I am very impatient. I'm not able to handle disappointments or frustration very well. When I was 16 years old, I had worked part-time at the West Shore Farmers Market. Excuse me, it was the Chestnut Street Market. It was down in Midtown Harrisburg. And I had gathered up $75 saved. And I bought a 1932 Ford. This was in 1933, by the way. So, I wish I had kept that. David, I would have consigned it to you right away. Anyway, my father was teaching me how to drive. 16-year-old kid, I was. And he said, do you see that little button in the middle of the steering wheel? I said, yes. I said, that's the horn button. He said, don't ever touch it. I said, what do you mean? I said, do you need that? He said, no. He said, you'll rarely ever need that. But what he didn't realize at that point, maybe he was getting the message, is that I'm not somebody who can handle disappointments or frustration very well without striking out or losing my poise, like at red lights, for example. Somehow or another, I always get back at the guy at the red light who's working on his cell phone or something else, and the light turns green, and he still sits there. I'm behind him. Beep, beep, and I come on, move on. You know, it might be 2 more minutes before it turns green again. Oh, that's a very immature thing for me to do. But that's me. I can't stand delays. Like when I get in line at the bank, you know, to drive-in window. Well, they used to have a window. Now they have a little tube that sucks the thing up through. But I always, somehow or another, when I would go to the drive-in window at the bank, would get right behind the guy or the woman who was settling up her mortgage or something. And the little tube would go up and go in. And then about 10 minutes later, back it came and back down. Evidently, she didn't sign something, so she took a pen and signed it. I'm sitting behind her saying, oh, come on, girl. And then up it would go and back again. Well, after a while, I was tempted to blow my horn, but I thought, no, if I do that, it'll slow things up. I'll just go to PNC instead or wherever. At any rate, I'm not able to handle disappointments or delays or frustration with poise, like when it rains, when you want to have an outdoor event. Every year, we have gone for many years to the Greek festival over in Camp Hill at the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church. Oh, good food and dancers. It's a nice thing. But it often rains. They only do it one weekend, I think, out of the year. And inevitably, invariably, it rains. And they work all year. By the way, a lot of that food has been in the freezer, for 6 months waiting. And I think to myself, oh, no, how could it be that this very weekend, and I get all upset about that because I'm immature when it comes to delays and frustration. All right, I had several other reasons, but let's move on. Yes, number 3. This is a good one. A person who is mature is able to cooperate with other people. You will find that in many situations, maybe most of your life, you will disagree with a lot of people that you work with or that you live with, even in your own family. Now, my son is of one political leaning, L-E-A-N-I-N-G. I'm not identifying, you see, because you're filming this. And I'm of the opposite. I'm an old geezer, you see. And so I'm a very staunch, dyed-in-the-wool conservative, and he identifies himself as a liberal. In any event, we're able to cooperate when we get together because we have a pact, P-A-C-T, and that is we will not talk about politics at all while we're here. But invariably we do, on something, Say, why didn't they shoot that balloon down right away? Well, I don't know. In any event, I have learned through the years to handle this, to be able to cooperate not only with my son, but with anybody that I find disagreement about something by using a little phrase, a 4-letter phrase. You may be right. It solves almost every problem. And he says, I think they should have shot that balloon down right away. And the other person says, no, I think they should have waited a minute, it cost the water. Don't argue about it. Just say, you may be right. That doesn't mean I agree with you, but it does shut you up. I've had people argue with me when I told them that I agreed with them. So, well, you may be right. And there are so many examples of this. In Lancaster County, there are 2 churches in particular. There are many churches, and this is being recorded, so I'm not naming them. But many years ago, the one church, which had grown to a considerable size, had a red carpet down the center aisle, beautiful red carpet, and it was getting worn and getting a little fuzzy. And so the church board had a meeting. So we need to put new carpeting down. So, all right, that's fine. Let's get another red carpet. Oh, no. Some of the board members and their wives, no doubt, disagreed. They said, I think we should change the color and have blue carpeting. No, we want red. This is a true story. Now, I'm not making this up. The church split over the decision about the color of the carpet. And there are 2 churches now in Lancaster County. They're known as the Red Church and the Blue Church because they were not mature enough to. Why didn't somebody on the board of directors say, okay, you may be right. Let's change the color. Who cares? We want to go home. At any rate, a person who's mature is able to cooperate with others because, and here's the principle, most things don't matter in life. Hardly anything matters that you do. Hardly anything really matters. Now, this you won't buy. I know you'll go home and say, boy, he was wrong about that. There's a lot of things that matter. No, they really don't. Not all that much. Most things don't matter. And so you can say to the person who's disagreeing with you, well, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. And if they don't argue with you about it, they'll think you're right. In any event, we learn, if we're mature, to cooperate with other people. Let me see. Where are we here? Oh, my. Yes, I'm at number 4. A person who's mature, oh, this is excellent, is able to make decisions. Decision making isn't easy sometimes. And yet, if you are mature, you're able to weigh the facts. You say, let's see, here's 1, 2, 3, 4 things. I believe this and that. And you say, let's do number 2, because you are mature enough to finally make up your mind. Well, I don't know what we should do. Oh, I don't like to be around people who can't. Well, I was one time down in Florida. I was speaking at a conference down there, and it was in the afternoon after lunch. So I had heard about a buffet restaurant. Now, I'm so old, there were no buffet restaurants in Harrisburg until Slug's Roost came along. That was a long time ago. I think that was the first one. In any event, so I heard about this big buffet, and I went in for lunch. And I got in line, and standing beside me, ahead of me in the line, were 2 very sweet little old ladies. I guess must have been about 102 years old. And they couldn't decide what to get, because we were in the vegetables at that point. And they were talking to each other. She says, I think that those green beans look good, but they don't cook them enough. I like mine to be soft. The other said, yes, well, the corn looks good, but I like white corn. I don't like yellow corn. Well, they were going on and on. Now, I'm the guy here in number 2 who handles frustration. I didn't have a horn button to push, or I would have pushed that, but I had a little time to spare, so I waited while they were discussing this. When all of a sudden, a guy came in and stood next to me, a great, big, hulking guy. Oh, you never saw a guy that big. And he was a truck driver. I didn't know what he was. And not all truck drivers are big guys, but he was. And he was worse than I was in terms of being immature. He said, why don't you move on, fella? And I said, oh, well, I can't. I'm stuck here because of these ladies. He said, those old women? And I said, yes, the ladies. He said, what's wrong with them? And I said, they can't decide what to get in the vegetables. They're debating about that. He said, why can't they make up their mind? And I said, well, evidently, when they were little girls growing up, their parents didn't allow them to participate in the decision-making process. So he said, what are you, some kind of head shrinker? And I said, well, yes, that's what I do. Well, he said, that's not going to help me keep my schedule. He said, I'm in a hurry. So he said, let me take care of those old girls. I said, all right. I said, now be gentle with them. This is a free country. So I stepped aside, and he moved over, and he said, good afternoon, ladies. Well, scared them half to death. They had read in the newspaper about these men that come up against you, in the shopping center, and they said, oh, hello. And he said, ladies, I don't see your choosing. He said, what's the matter? They said, well, everything looks so good, and we don't know what to get. And he said, well, ladies, I drive through here once a week, through Orlando. And he said, I always stop for lunch at this restaurant because it was one of the first big buffets in the world. And so he said, I know what's good. I said, oh, that's nice. He said, yes, ladies, let me help you. Take the peas. Well, both ladies, oh, all right. They got their tray, and they put peas on the tray. Then he said, now, ladies, we're coming to the meat. He said, their meatloaf here is really good. It's not leftovers from yesterday. And he said, their gravy is so nice. It's that nice dark gravy. He said, take meatloaf over here and put gravy on it. Oh, thank you, they said. So they moved down and took the meatloaf and so forth. Well, finally we got through the line, and I was sitting in one seat, and he was over here, and they were there. And he caught my eye. He looked over, and he went like that. And I thought, well, fella, you're right. Those 2 old women didn't need a psychologist to help them. They needed a daddy to come along who could tell them what to do. And they obeyed. So in any event, they were indecisive. And it is hard. It's like when you're auctioned. You know, I watch your auctions on my computer. My wife often says, "What in the world are you doing now?" I hear something going ka-chick, ka-chick, ka-chick. I said, "Well, I'm watching an auction." He said, "What, does the guy have a cold or something?" I said, "No, he's not sneezing. That indicates they're moving on to the next item." Anyway, we're able to make decisions wisely. And sometimes we blow it. We make a big mistake. But that's all right. You'll get past that. And if you can make decisions, you will be in a better position in life, whether it's occupationally or in family life, in anything. I could think of a few other things. But if you're able to make decisions wisely. And one time, a student of mine, I was on the faculty over at Dickinson College in the psych department, and I had a young student, bright kid, and he said, "Well, isn't it true, Professor, that you have to get all the facts? If you get all the facts, then you can make a decision. It's not so hard to do." And I said, "Yeah, that would be true if you could get all the facts, but nobody ever gets all the facts. You just don't get them all. No matter how carefully you describe my guns in March, when they go up, they're not going to get all the facts." Well, no, it was Eric had checked me in last time. In any event, if every one of my guns is unfired, it's never had a round of ammunition installed. I collected them as a collection. And they came right from the factory where they fire one round to make sure it works. But I said, if you just said in your auction, these are all virgins. These guns have never been loaded or fired. Many of the people watching the auction would say, he's not telling the truth. But anyway, a person who's mature is able to make good decisions. Okay, now that was the old ladies. All right, now I'm at number 5. Boy, we're almost, they do have a clock back there, don't they? And number 5, I'm parked way down at the end of the parking lot where all the new cars park. You ever notice that? You go down the row of cars in a parking lot, the cars get newer and newer and newer because they don't want their door to get scratched. They think, well, if I park far away, nobody will park next. Excuse me. That was not on my list here, but that occurred to me. All right, you make decisions. Oh, yes. A person who's mature is able to postpone a present satisfaction for a future greater good. You say, well, if I do this, it's going to take longer. But I'd rather take a little longer and it'll work out better. I had that experience myself. My original college was over in Carlisle at Dickinson, and I got a bachelor's degree in psychology, but you can't do anything with a bachelor's degree much, and you can't get licensed. And so I went on to Syracuse University and enrolled in a doctoral program there. And I was there for a couple of years. But then, of all things, I saw on the bulletin board in the main building at the university, where they thumbtack all those announcements, that the federal government, in those days it was called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW. Now it's Human Services. But it said there that New York University was offering a full tuition scholarship to anyone who had a master's degree in psychology and wanted to go on in a doctoral program if they will apply to NYU. New York University is a private school, by the way. A lot of people think it's a city school, but it's privately owned. They own Muller Macaroni. How they get away with that, David, I don't know. A nonprofit. Anyway, I applied for the thing, and of all things, I got the grant. Now, when the government gives you something, they always take more back than they give you. That's been my experience. So here it was, full tuition, all the books. And you know that textbooks are really expensive. And believe it or not, this is in the 50s, $1,000 a semester walking around money. It was, oh, this is wonderful. But I was too young and naive to know in those days that the government never gives you anything unless they take more back. So when I finally applied and was accepted, and my wife and I moved to Manhattan, to New York, I discovered that the hook there was that I had to sign a contract to perform 2 years internship at Bellevue Hospital in the psychiatric. Well, I thought, that's okay. That's great experience. And they're giving me all this money. And Sue's working up there at the hospital with all those surgical cases. And so we began our time living in Manhattan. Now, the point I'm making here is a mature person can postpone a present satisfaction for future greater good. Well, after about a year living there, I came home one time and said to my wife, I think we ought to take a break and just go back to Harrisburg for a while. I said, all of our friends back home are married, they're having babies, they're having jobs, they're getting promotions, they're moving on, and here we are in Manhattan. We had a nice apartment there, had an elevator. Yeah, we were getting so much money from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Anyway, I said, so let's just, I'll put in a note to my advisor here that we're going to take a break. Don't you do it, she said. Now, my wife is much more mature than I am. Oh, in just about everything. If she ever sees this tape, don't let her watch it. But it's true. She said, it'll only take another year, maybe, until you finish the internship there and graduate, and then we can go back to Harrisburg. No. I said, I want to leave right now. Well, anyway, being stubborn and bullheaded and immature as I am many times, I saw an ad in the New York newspaper by Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company, and they were looking for a person to be the assistant personnel director of Johnson & Johnson. Well, there was a master's degree. I had already been an Army psychologist for several years, and I thought maybe I would qualify for that. So I got on the train, and I went over, to make a long story short. And I went in and I was interviewed by the bigwig, the personnel director. Now they call them something else, human resources or some. Every time they change a name, it becomes more obscure. Now we don't have a receptionist at Messiah Village. We have a resident and guest services. That's what the sign says. So the guy comes in, delivering a package. He says, where's the receptionist? And they say, well, over there. He says, no, that says residents and guests. I'm not a resident. I'm not a guest. You see, we change things. Libraries now are materials resource centers. Anyway, how did I get on this toot? Anyway, here was the personnel director, and he interviewed me, and he said, everything checks out very well, but we have a test. I said, you have a test? He said, yes. I said, that's what one of my one of the points I was majoring in my doctoral program here was called psychometrics, tests and measurements. Good. Then he said, you'll enjoy this. This is a personnel test. So he said, you go sit in the other room there, and when you're done, he said, bring it back. So I went in and sat down. Well, as I looked at it, it was called the Otis, O-T-I-S, like the elevator, Otis short form intelligence test. And I thought, in my internship in psychometrics, I had done factor analyses on every point on that test. I had worked for almost a year analyzing the validity and the reliability of all this. I knew it backwards and forwards. So I got carried away. I maxed it out. I knew exactly what to mark for every one of the answers because I was the one that had reviewed them for several years. And I called his secretary, and she came and took it back, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And after a while, she ushered me in, and he said, we'll be in touch. Oh, I said, please, tell me, what about my tests and so forth? And he didn't tell me, but I knew that I had the highest IQ that he had ever tested in his life. I really didn't, but it looked that way on the test because I knew all the answers. Anyway, I never heard from them. Well, I got a polite letter back saying the position's already been filled. I probably intimidated him a little, had more intelligence than he did, or he thought so. But in any event, the point is, I was trying to postpone a present satisfaction I was trying not to postpone a present satisfaction, finishing my work there for a greater good, to move back to Harrisburg. But Sue won. My wife won out. She's more, by the way, one of the things I had to do in that program was to test IQs of 50 people, and she was one of them. I never told her what the result was because hers was higher than mine. I didn't tell her that. But in any event, she's always been much more mature than I am. And she won out. We stayed on and then moved back to Harrisburg, and I was immediately offered a job as a school psychologist at Central Dauphin High School. There was only one high school then. There's no East Central Dauphin. Anyway, it worked out okay for us. Our children were always a little younger than our friends' children, but it didn't make any difference because it worked out well. We were able to postpone a present satisfaction for a future greater good. Now that has to do with spending money. I have always been prone to bid too much at auctions. You'll love this, David. I mean, this is like music to your ears. But I get carried away sometimes because I see, that's Smith & Wesson 686. I want that gun. And the bids go up and up and up. And I keep bidding up. Finally hollers down the steps. Sue says, "Stop bidding," because she knows that I can't postpone a future satisfaction for a future greater good. One time let's see, we're almost finished here, aren't we? Yes. One time, I don't know where you are, but you'll have anything better to do. So let me go on. One time a lady called me from New Cumberland. You know where that is, David. Yes. And she had a cloisonné water bottle. It was about that big. A Chinese water bottle. Her father had been the American ambassador to China years ago. And when he retired or came home, they presented him with this. Chinese antiquity, as you know, you don't get that easily anymore. But in those days, it wasn't as hard. Anyway, she had this beautiful bottle. It had an inlaid clock right in the middle. It hadn't originally had a clock. But anyway, she said, "Would you like to buy this from me?" I said, "Oh, yes, I would." And I could see dollar signs in my head. And I said, or she said, "How much will you give me for it?" Now, we know better than that, don't we, David? Oh, I never, ever tell a person. I always turn around and say, "What would you take for it? What would you be happy to accept for this?" Well, she told me an amount that was so low. Now, I am not dishonest. I'm not a crook. So Richard Nixon used to say that, didn't he? Well, I am not a crook. Excuse me, they're recording this. I said to her, "I never offer for anything. You tell me what you would be happy to receive for this, and if I resell it, and make a lot of money," and because I said, "I think this is worth a lot more." Her amount, I don't remember, $150 or something. Anyway, she said, "Well, I don't know what to ask." I said, "Ask largely, whatever you want." So she came up with an amount. I don't even remember, it was so long ago, about $200. So I said, "You're sure now? If you see this was sold for a lot, that's okay." She said, "You should have seen the house that the clock was in there, a big mansion." So I said, "All right, thank you." Make a long story short, we're talking about money here. I sent a picture. This was in the days when there was no internet, believe it or not. Most of you are probably amazed to know that. And in fact, there was no fax machine in those days. You took a picture of something and you mailed it. So I mailed it to Sotheby's. That's a small company over in New York City. That's one of your competitors. At any rate, about a week after I put the picture of the clock in the mail, I got a call from the head of their appraisal department there. And she was such a nice lady. She said, "We would like you to consign that to our auction. It's worth a great deal." And I said, oh, I'm glad to hear that. I said, let's do it. And she said, now, we publish, I don't know what you call it, a catalog showing pictures of everything. And she said, we'd like to feature this clock. It's so important. By the way, what's in Washington, D.C., the big museum. Oh, yes, thank you. I didn't wear my hearing aids. The Smithsonian called me. They got wind of it. They said, we're half government and half private, and we'd like you to donate that. Oh, no. Anyway, to make a long story short, the guy at Sotheby's said, now we'd like to do a full page in color. I said, oh, that sounds good to me. He said, there's a fee for that. I said, you mean to me? He said, yes. Now, this is true. This was years ago. I said, how much? He said, $900. Well, I said, now, you must be out of your mind. No, he said, you'll get a lot more. I said, but that's gambling. I said, you know, auctions are gambles. Well, it is. It's like our son was vice president of an insurance company. That's gambling, too. They bet your house is going to burn down, or you bet that it is, and they bet that it won't. It's gambling. I said, I'm not going to pay $900. He said, well, we can put it on a page with other pictures, and that would only be $400. I said, oh, I don't like. He said, it'll sell a lot better. I said, all right, go ahead. We'll risk the $400. To make a long story short, we were doing the antique show over at the Carlisle Fairgrounds when the auction was held. I don't know how long ago it was, but we didn't have cell phones. But our daughter arrived. She drove the whole way down from Camp Hill to tell me. She said, Dad, she said, the auction's over. And she told me what the clock sold for. But in any event, you say, what's the point you're trying to make here? Oh, about money. We're able to postpone a present satisfaction for a future greater good. And leaving school on time, selling something prematurely or not selling it is a mark of maturity. It has to do also with sex, but since this is being recorded, I'm skipping that part, except that as young people are growing up, they have a tendency to find it difficult, I need to word this carefully, find it difficult to postpone a present satisfaction for a future greater good. They have a tendency, but mature people can, either mature people or people who have a glandular disturbance. I don't know which is which. At any rate, that's number 5. Now, by the way, I'm going to be finished ahead of time, I think. Number 6.
Unintended.
What's oh, this is good. A person who's mature is not a perfectionist. You're not a perfect. Are you? It's terrible to work for. Now, David, I hope, is not a perfectionist, saying, "Why didn't you do this right?" You say, "Well, if I knew how to do it right, I would have done it right." And I think maybe you wouldn't have done it right either. Well, you don't talk back to David that way, but perfectionism is something that's very hard to come by. We were driving down the road one time in our car, back in the old days when cars had CB radios. You remember that? The little microphone that hung on a hook, and we always talked to truckers. Breaker, breaker, you'd say various things. Anyway, my son was a teenager. He was riding beside me as I drove along, and he crossed his legs, and his foot hit the microphone and broke the little hook that it was hanging on, snapped it off, and it dropped down onto the floor of the car. And I said, oh, Christopher. I said, now, why don't you look out when you're crossing those big feet? I said, you're growing up now and your feet are getting big. What, now you've broken my CB. Well, he listened carefully. See, he had lived for 12, 13 years with a psychologist. So he gave me about $100 worth of therapy. He said, I see, yes, I see. And he said, Dad, I did that because it was a mistake. And if it hadn't been a mistake, I wouldn't have made a mistake. But I made a mistake because it was a mistake, and I make mistakes just like you. And he pointed, I said, oh, forgive me, Christopher. That's right. You had no way of doing it, and I do things worse than that. And I can't be perfectionistic. I spoke at West Point one time. I have to get that in. I was an Army officer, a military psychologist, so I was in the Adjutant General's Department of the Army. But somebody got wind of the fact because I had lived in Carlisle while I was in college. I spoke at the War College over there several times later. Somebody got wind of the fact that I was a cheap speaker. That is, they didn't have to spend much to get me to speak. And so I got a call from the military academy in West Point, and it was from a Colonel Graves. And he said, I'm on the faculty here, and we're having a weekend retreat with all of our faculty members. They have scores of faculty. I mean, I don't know how many. They even have a high school. But anyhow, that is for the kids of the staff that work there. He said, would you come over and do some kind of a seminar? I said, oh, yes, I have one. He said, what would it be on the topic? I said, marks of a mature Army officer. At any rate, because this all fits whatever you put it into. And so I went over and delivered my talk to the officers there. Oh, Colonel Graves and his wife said, bring your family, your wife and your kids, and they give us, because he was a colonel, they give us a cottage here on the campus, and we'll put you up for the weekend. Oh, that's wonderful. So we did that. Our daughter was thrilled. She was about 14, I guess, and I got her picture standing beside two of those cadets. I think she framed it in gold. Now it was, just a wonderful experience. And when we were finished with the weekend, we stayed overnight Sunday night yet in their home. Colonel Graves said, we're having an inspection tomorrow of the barracks, the cadet barracks. He said, you were an officer. I said, yes, I was, sir. And he said, would you like to go along with the inspection party, and see how that goes? I said, oh, I would enjoy that very much. And so we went Monday morning into the cadet barracks, and I got a little ahead of the inspectors, the inspection team. And I walked down the hall, and all these young men were standing there, not moving a muscle, in the hallway beside their doors, their dorm room doors. Anyway, I went up to one of the cadets, and I said, cadet, he said, yes, sir. See, they didn't know who I was. Most people don't get to go through on the inspections. They might have thought I was the, Secretary of Defense or something. Anyway, he said, yes, sir. I said, come on in here once. I went, oh, boy, I said, I'm really impressed. I said, everything in here is, the Army used to call it dress right dress. Everything was neat. On the desk, if they had papers there, they were neatly arranged. They, at college, our papers were all over the floor, and the desk drawers were pulled open, and the pencils and erasers, we didn't use ballpoint pens then. But anyway, everything was lined up very neatly and all of that. And I said, cadet, he said, yes, sir. Didn't even move, just his lips moved. Yes, sir, he said. I said, I see your wastebasket has nothing in it here. He said, no, sir. Well, I said, what do you do with your waste paper? And he smiled a little bit. He said, we eat it, sir. And he said, no, you can't arrange waste paper neatly. So he said, we take it out into the hall. There's a receptacle there. And he said, by the way, he looked me up and down. He said, would you go out in the hall also? I said, yeah, I don't look so neat either after this weekend. But at any rate, I said to the Colonel Graves. By the way, I spoke at the War College in Carlisle several years later. And Mrs. Graves it was a banquet. I said, oh, Mrs. Graves, it's so good to see you again. How's Colonel Graves? Oh, she said, he's now General Graves. He's the commandant here at the War College. I said, oh, excuse me. At any rate, how are you doing? I said to the officers afterwards, what did you think about our inspection? I said, well, I'm a little concerned because I think you're demanding something that these kids don't have. I mean, they were only like 23, 24 years old. And he said, what's that? He said, nobody has perfection to give. I said, you don't dare say to someone, why did you do that? Like I did to my son. He said, I did it because I make mistakes, just like you. Oh, he said they wouldn't dare say that to the colonel. I said, no, they wouldn't. But I said, you're making these young men perfectionists. You can't be a perfectionist in combat. I was trained in every kind of weapon. Oh, you'll know how old I am now. We used even flamethrowers. You know what they were? It was a little thing like a tube, and you'd squeeze a button, and whoosh, some napalm would shoot out, and various other things, old-fashioned. We had bayonet training. I was trained with the 82nd Airborne Division down in Fort Bragg. That was 1950, 52, 53. They were still doing bayonet training. We were being trained. There was our basic officer combat training. And they had a big, what is that thing? They had a big bag hanging up like boxers pound on, and a canvas bag. And then you would run up and stick your bayonet in there and turn it halfway and pull it out because it pulled out more meat, they said, if you do it that way. Well, it wasn't long after that bayonet practice was abandoned by the military because young men in the armed forces found it very difficult, most of them impossible, to jam a bayonet into another human being. Now, some did it with joy, but most didn't do it. It's much more impersonal to shoot someone, to stand 50 yards away, bang, that's it. You may be somebody's husband or father, but I didn't have to stick you with my bayonet, so they dropped that. Anyway, I say, you're making these young men perfectionists, and you can't be a perfectionist in combat, in the Army. And he said, no, sir. But he said, what we're doing is raising their level of perfection this high, knowing that it'll drop back some. But he said, if you only raise it this high, then it'll go too low. And they said, these young men are all going to be commissioned as officers in the United States Army, and they'd better be trained well and almost to perfection. Well, I didn't buy all that, but anyway, that was number 6. I don't know where you are. That was 6. A person who's mature is not perfectionistic. I think I only have one more. Who knows? Number 7, a person who's mature is able to accept praise and criticism graciously. Now, we covered this a little bit before, but if somebody compliments you on something, say, hey, you did a really good job over here on Paxton Street last week, don't argue with them. I've had people actually argue with me when I complimented them. And I told you what to say. Just say, well, thank you very much. 4 words. Don't say, oh, no, well, there were some mistakes anyway. Don't do that. Somebody says, you did a great job with so-and-so. Thank you very much. That doesn't mean you agree with them, but it means that you're being polite. And if they criticize you, on the other hand, don't argue with them. Just say those other 4 words. You may be right. That doesn't mean I agree or I disagree, but it'll shut you up. You may be right. That's it. So you're able to accept praise and criticism with poise. Now let's see. Oh, I remember my mother, my dear mother, my sainted mother. She was tended to be overweight. You can tell it's a DNA matter. And she was at a church luncheon, and a friend that she hadn't met for quite a few years happened to be there at that church luncheon. And she came over to my mother, and she's, well, Betty, it's so good to see you again after all these years. And she said, now, Betty, I see you've put on a lot of weight. And now my mother was about 80 at the time. She said, and in fact, Betty, you look like you're ready to butcher. Well, my mother almost fainted. That was a terrible thing to say to someone. But my mother had listened to this message so often that she could do it herself. And so she said, well, you may be right. And the lady said, oh, and she turned around and walked away. I said to my mother, that's how to get rid of them. And just do that. Because you're able to accept praise and criticism. Well, the praise is thank you very much. The criticism, you may be right. It always works. It always does. Now, I think that's just about all. David, we're just about ready to go. Yeah, David's waving his arm. That was, I only got through, 8 of these. I don't know what you did, but I have 18. I had 10 more. But I'm going to close with just one example. All right. And this is A person who's mature is able to derive satisfaction from simple pleasures. You don't have to have all kinds of big showy things going on in order to be satisfied with it or to enjoy it. You're able to derive no, I beg your pardon. You have to erase this part. I got to the wrong point, but that was a good point anyway. This one, a person who's mature, this is the end, must have a realistic attitude toward your abilities. How good are you at what you do? Like my friend Harold up at Whitmer Motors, he was a great mechanic. And how are you at what you do? And this is my last example. I was the MC of a large gathering in an auditorium where they had just purchased a big pipe organ. Oh, man, was that nice. The largest pipe organ in the world is in Atlantic City, by the way, in case you wondered. And the second largest was down at Wanamaker's in Philadelphia. That's a bit of trivia. In case someone consigns one of those to you, you'll know what to say. Anyway, what was the point? Oh, have a realistic attitude. Now, the lady who was going to come in and demonstrate it to this audience was held up somewhere in traffic or whatever. She couldn't get there. And so I apologized to the people, and I said, I'm so sorry that Mrs. So-and-so isn't able to come here today. And I said, is there anyone in the audience here who can play the piano or the organ in any degree at all? And a young boy put his hand up toward the back of the room. And I thought, oh no, this is a teenage kid. And I thought, oh boy, I bet he doesn't have a realistic attitude about his ability. He thinks too much of himself. So I said, come up here. And he came up and I said, can you play the organ? And he said, yes. I said, are you any good? He said, I'm the best there is. Well, I thought, oh boy, now what do we have here? I said, are you kidding me? He said, no, I am. I said, all right, go ahead. So he sat down at the organ and began to play. Well, my hair stood on end. I never heard anything as wonderful as that. Oh, it was amazing. And everyone applauded and cheered. And afterwards, we thanked him for volunteering. As he walked by, I said, excuse me. I said, you are pretty good. Oh, he said, I'm the best there is. I said, well, that's what you said before. He said, I just won the pipe organ competition out in Omaha last week. I said, oh, good. He had a realistic attitude. He was the best there is, although he was a little egotistical about it. But in any event, to be mature, we have to realize our shortcomings and our abilities. Well, anyway, that's where I'm going to quit now. You'll be glad to know. And I do have about 9 more points next year. If you want to have this, I'll come back. Thank you very much.